James Hartley's hands shook as he pushed the tattered, half-empty shopping cart down the cracked sidewalk. His fingers, once so steady in the sterile confines of an operating room, trembled now with the weight of a life undone. His face, once sharp and clean-cut, had softened with the years, the lines deepened by regret and an unforgiving sense of time lost. His body had the gaunt look of someone who no longer cared to fight the battle of self-preservation. His clothes, dirty, worn, and ill-fitting, were a far cry from the crisp, white coat he had once worn, the emblem of his hard-earned success. The cart, a collection of discarded bottles and tattered newspapers, was his only companion, the only thing that seemed to make sense in the chaos of his mind. There was a numbness about him now, a distance from the world that no amount of alcohol could mask. He had been a surgeon once, a healer, a man with a purpose, but that had been years ago, before the fall, before the addiction had stripped him of everything. The operating room had once been his sanctuary, a place where precision and skill could transform lives. Now, it felt like a distant dream, a memory fading into the fog of his past. James could still remember the first time he had picked up a scalpel, how it had felt in his hand, how it had hummed with power, how it had seemed to promise him a future that was bright and limitless. But somewhere along the way, somewhere between the long hours and the crushing pressure, he had lost himself. He had been a young doctor, eager to save the world, until the nights had gotten longer, and the alcohol had numbed the edges of his relentless drive. It had started slowly, just a drink after a difficult surgery, a way to unwind. But then, like a patient on the operating table, it had taken hold of him, inch by inch, until there was nothing left but the thirst, the craving, the need to forget. He had tried to stop. He had tried so many times, each attempt followed by failure, each failure deeper than the last. There were rehabs, there were therapists, there were promises made in the dark hours of the morning, after yet another bender. But the promises never lasted. The alcohol was a comfort, familiar, soothing, and it offered him temporary relief from the weight of everything he had lost. His career, his relationships, his self-respect, all gone, slipping through his fingers like sand. Now, as he shuffled down the street, a thin film of sweat clinging to his forehead, he could feel the cold fingers of regret pressing down on him again. He glanced at the people walking by, businessmen in suits, mothers pushing strollers, young couples laughing and holding hands, and he felt like an alien in his own city. His eyes were glazed, his mind foggy, but he still remembered the faces of those he had once worked on, the lives he had saved, the families he had helped. Was there a time when he had mattered? Was there a time when he had been proud of what he did? He turned a corner, his eyes catching the flickering neon sign of a dive bar. His stomach growled, but not from hunger. No, this was a deeper craving, a need. He could almost hear the clink of glass, the low murmur of voices, the warmth of the alcohol sliding down his throat. Just one drink, he told himself. One drink wouldn't hurt, just enough to take the edge off. But then, something shifted. Something inside him pulled him away from the bar. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was the faint memory of a time when he had tried to be better. Perhaps it was the small voice inside him, buried deep under layers of shame, telling him that he didn't want to go down this road again. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of the decision hanging in the air, and then, almost reluctantly, he moved on, pushing his cart forward as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. The streets felt endless, stretching out before him in a blur of indistinguishable buildings and half-lit signs. He didn't know where he was going. Maybe nowhere. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. It was easier that way, to let the world fade into the background, to lose himself in the anonymity of the city. The loneliness was his constant companion, the only thing that never abandoned him, the only thing that knew him truly. And yet, despite the emptiness, there was a flicker of something in him. A small spark, barely perceptible but there, nonetheless. A flicker of a life that could have been. As he walked, a black car pulled up beside him, its engine purring softly in the night. The door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and confident, his face shadowed by the streetlights. James didn't immediately recognize him. His mind was too clouded, but something about the man seemed familiar, like a distant echo of something he couldn't quite place. The man didn't seem to mind the dirt and disarray of James's appearance. Instead, he simply stood there, his eyes soft with understanding, his posture open, as if waiting for something. James stopped, his heart quickening slightly. He could feel the weight of the stranger's gaze, not judgmental, but curious, like he was seeing something James hadn't shown anyone in years. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, he just stood there, caught in the unexpected moment. The man didn't say anything at first, just watched him for a moment longer. And then, as if guided by some quiet intuition, he stepped forward, his presence gentle, steady, as though he knew exactly what to do. "You're not lost," the man said, his voice low and reassuring. "But you've been looking for something, haven't you?" James blinked, confused by the words, by the way they seemed to reach inside him, like the hand of a stranger pulling him from the darkness. And in that moment, James realized he had been looking for something he didn't even know he had been missing until now. The man didn't step back, didn't flinch when James's eyes narrowed in suspicion. There was something about him, an aura of calm confidence, something that seemed almost too much for a street corner in the dim glow of a neon sign. James had seen hundreds of faces pass by in his years on these streets, each of them strangers, each of them ghosts in their own right. But this man, this one, was different. He stood there, waiting, with an unspoken patience, as though time itself had slowed around him. James wasn't sure why, but his feet seemed to move of their own accord. He took a step forward, just one, then another, until the distance between them had closed to nothing. The strange pull this man exerted on him was undeniable. Maybe it was the way he looked, his well-fitted suit, the calm composure he exuded even in this place where no one ever belonged. But there was something else, something beneath the surface. The kind of warmth that shouldn't exist in a city of steel and glass. "Who are you?" James finally managed, his voice raspy from lack of use. It wasn't the question that had been nagging at him, but it was the only one his mouth could form. The weight of the past sat heavily on his chest, and the shame he felt was almost suffocating. For a moment, he thought the stranger might turn away, but instead, he smiled small, not condescending, but rather kind, like someone who knew too much and yet didn't judge. "George," the man said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He extended his hand. George Clooney. The name hit James like a hammer. Clooney. Hollywood. Fame. Success. It wasn't possible, was it? What was he doing here in this forgotten corner of the city? James blinked, fighting the fog in his mind, trying to place the words with the man standing before him. He had seen the actor on TV countless times. The face, the voice. He knew it from the silver screen, from the whispers in the press, from the world that had long ago passed him by. But why would someone like that be here, talking to someone like him? "Yeah, right?" James muttered, half under his breath, the skepticism still heavy in his tone. His eyes flickered toward the man's car. A sleek, black vehicle, pristine and out of place amidst the grime of the street. There was no way. "Why would someone like you want to talk to someone like me?" George didn't flinch. He didn't take offense or recoil. Instead, he seemed to understand the question, not just the words but the feeling behind them. He took a step closer, his eyes kind but unwavering. "Because, James, I see you. I see what you're going through. You're not the first person I've met who's walked down this road." The mention of his name made James's chest tighten, as though the stranger had somehow known him his whole life. But James didn't feel like someone who could be seen. Not anymore. He was invisible now, nothing but a forgotten face on the edge of a city that no longer cared. "I'm not who I used to be," James said, his voice barely a whisper. His mind raced, recalling the glory days, the triumphs, the surgeries that had once saved lives, the patients who had trusted him, the praise from colleagues. He had been someone back then, someone who mattered, but all of it, his life, his identity, had evaporated like mist, dissipating with every drink, every failed attempt at finding his way out of the darkness. The weight of it all was unbearable, and every day, every hour, felt like he was sinking deeper into the quicksand. George took a step forward, his gaze steady and firm. "Neither am I," he said, his voice soft but firm, as though he were speaking from the depths of his own experiences. There was something there, in his eyes, something James couldn't quite grasp, but that stirred something deep within him. "I've lost more than most people ever will, and I've fallen just as far as you have in some ways. But I'm still here, and so are you. That's something." James didn't know how to respond. How could he? What words could capture the years of destruction, the relationships lost, the life he had let slip through his fingers like water? He wanted to push this man away, to tell him to leave him alone, to tell him that nothing mattered anymore. But instead, he stood there, rooted in place, unable to move, his eyes fixed on the face of a man who spoke as though he understood something that James didn't. "I've been where you are," George continued, his voice gentle now. "I've watched people I love die. I've made mistakes that cost me more than I could ever explain. But I found my way back. And I'm telling you, James, you can too." The words hung in the air between them, not as a promise, not as some hollow attempt at reassurance, but as a quiet statement of truth. James swallowed hard, the dry, bitter feeling in his throat rising up. He could feel the sting of tears threatening, but he quickly pushed it down. He wasn't ready to break. Not here, not now. But still, something about George's presence, the weight of his words, sank deep into James's heart. He wasn't used to being seen, especially not by someone who had everything. A famous actor, a man of power, of influence. What could he possibly want with a broken doctor who had nothing left? Yet here he was, standing in front of James, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. George smiled, this time with an understanding that reached beyond the surface. "You don't have to fix everything today, James. You don't have to do anything but take the next step. And I'm here. I've been where you are. And I'll be here when you're ready to move forward. But you've got to take that first step." James didn't know what to say, didn't know if he could take that first step. But as he stood there, facing this man who had known pain and loss, something stirred within him. Maybe it was the hint of hope he had pushed away for so long. Maybe it was the simple human connection they shared in that moment. For the first time in a long time, James didn't feel completely alone. George clapped him lightly on the shoulder, a gesture full of empathy and solidarity, and then, with a last glance, turned toward the car. "You think about what I said, James. I'll be around. I'm not going anywhere." James watched him walk away, the sound of the car door closing echoing in his ears. He didn't know what had just happened, didn't know if he was ready for any of it. But for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Maybe even since before the fall. He felt a glimmer of possibility, a spark. And that, for James, was the beginning of something new. The next few days felt like a blur, a haze that James couldn't quite shake off. He kept replaying the encounter with George over and over in his mind. The words, the look in his eyes, that quiet confidence he had exuded. It was the first real human connection he had felt in years, maybe ever. And yet, as much as he wanted to brush it off, to ignore the pull it had on him, he couldn't. At night, he lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the small room he had claimed in a cheap, run-down hotel, his hands restless at his sides. The weight of his own body, the tiredness, the despair. Everything pressed down on him, and it felt like he was suffocating. But amidst it all, there was a question that clung to him, a question that had settled deep in his chest. What if? What if George was right? What if there was still a chance for him to change? He had heard those words before, from the rehabs, from the therapists, from the support groups. The promises of redemption had always seemed distant, hollow. "You just need to stop drinking," they would say. "You need to find a reason to live." But what did any of that really mean when the only thing that had ever brought him relief was a bottle? How could he change when every step forward felt like it took him further away from the man he once was? But George's words, they had been different. There was something in his voice, something real, something that didn't feel like a cliché. Maybe it was the fact that George wasn't just offering empty sympathy, wasn't just another person telling him what he should do. No, George had spoken from experience. There was an understanding there, a shared history of pain that James couldn't ignore. The next morning, James woke up early, the sun barely breaking through the grime of the city's skyline. He didn't feel ready. He didn't feel better. But for the first time in ages, he felt a faint trace of resolve, like a small ember deep in his chest. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew that something had shifted. He found himself wandering the streets again, aimlessly at first, but then he realized. He was heading toward the place where he had met George, the bar. The neon sign was flickering, almost stubbornly, as if it had been waiting for him. The same place he had almost given into temptation days before. This time, when he reached the door, he didn't hesitate. He pushed it open and walked in, his shoes tapping softly against the worn floorboards. The bar was empty at this hour, the low hum of the air conditioner the only sound in the room. It was quiet, almost too quiet. But then, through the dim light, he saw George sitting at the far end of the counter, a glass of water in front of him, his dark eyes watching the door. He didn't look surprised when James walked in. In fact, he looked almost relieved, like he had known James would come. James didn't speak at first. He simply sat down next to George, his movements stiff, unsure. The weight of everything, the addiction, the shame, the sense of loss, seemed heavier here, in this place that had once represented escape. George took a slow sip of his water, then set the glass down, turning slightly to face James. "You came," he said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "You didn't have to." James didn't know how to answer that. He didn't know if he was ready for anything. "I don't know what I'm doing," he finally admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them. He wasn't even sure why he was telling the stranger, a man with a life so far removed from his own. But there it was, the truth, raw and untamed. "I don't know how to stop everything. I've tried before. It never works." George nodded slowly, his expression understanding, unhurried. "I know. I've been there too. It's not about stopping everything at once. It's about finding something, no matter how small, that reminds you why you should keep going." James looked at George, his mind reeling. This man, this famous actor who seemed to have it all, success, fame, wealth, was telling him that it wasn't about everything. It was about something. He felt the words settle around him like a blanket, their weight gentle, but real. "I used to think I could do it alone," George continued, his voice lowering slightly, a trace of vulnerability seeping into his tone. "I thought if I just kept it all bottled up, I could handle it. But the truth is I couldn't. Not until I started to open up to people. Not until I allowed myself to lean on someone else." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't allowed himself to lean on anyone in years. The isolation had become a part of him, something he wore like a second skin. But something about George's honesty made him want to try. It made him want to believe that there was more to life than the bottle, more to his existence than the endless cycle of addiction and despair. "What do you want from me?" James asked, his voice rough, as though the question itself was too heavy to ask. George didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned back, his hands folding in front of him, as if preparing for a long conversation. "I want you to stop running," he said simply. "Stop running from your past, from your mistakes. I want you to start living, even if it's just a little at a time. I want you to remember that you're not defined by what you've lost. You're defined by what you choose to do next." James swallowed hard. The words felt like they cut through the layers of shame and fear that had clouded his mind for so long. He had spent so many years running from his addiction, from his mistakes, from the people who might have cared, because he didn't believe he was worth anything. He didn't believe anyone would care if he just vanished into the void. But George was still here. He wasn't just offering empty words. He was offering something more. A chance. A chance to step forward, even if it was one small, faltering step. "I don't know if I can do it," James said, the vulnerability creeping into his voice now. The walls he had spent so long building up were starting to crumble, and it scared him. George leaned in a little, his voice soft but firm. You don't have to know everything right now. Just take the next step. That's all. I'm here. And I know what it's like to feel like you're lost. But you don't have to stay there. You can make a choice." The words hung in the air between them, not as a command but as an invitation. An invitation to begin again, to try even when everything seemed impossible. James didn't have an answer, but in that moment, for the first time in years, he felt something stir deep within him. A fragile thread of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he could still change. And maybe, just maybe, someone else saw him as more than just a lost cause. "I'll try," James whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words meant anything yet, or if he was even ready to take the steps he so desperately needed to take. But for the first time, he wasn't alone in the dark. The days after that conversation with George passed by like slow-moving clouds, each one heavier than the last. James had agreed to try. That simple, quiet promise was all he had, but it felt monumental in its own way. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of something better, though doubt still gnawed at him like a persistent, hungry animal. He wasn't ready to believe in full-blown redemption. Not yet, not by a long shot. But maybe there was room for small changes. Maybe he could start small. He had no idea what starting even looked like, but George had told him to take it one step at a time. One step. That was manageable, right? Or at least it sounded manageable. James spent his mornings walking the streets aimlessly. The weather was colder now, the chill of autumn creeping into the air, biting at his skin. He wore his jacket tighter around him, a feeble shield against the weight of everything he carried. He couldn't stop thinking about what George had said. You don't have to fix everything at once. But how did someone go about fixing anything at all when it felt like everything was broken beyond repair? He looked at the people walking past him, those who had somewhere to go, who had a purpose, who were living. He could feel their eyes slide over him, the pity and avoidance clear in their glances. He didn't blame them. How could he? He wasn't the man he had once been. He had forgotten what it felt like to matter. One day, as he wandered through the city, his eyes caught a glimpse of a familiar place. A community health clinic he had worked at years ago before the descent into addiction had taken over his life. The building was small, tucked between a laundromat and a diner, but it had always been busy, full of people in need, people who couldn't afford the high-priced services elsewhere. He used to love working there, the feeling of being useful, of healing, of making a difference. It had been the first place where he had truly felt like he had a calling, where his skills could do something real. He stopped in front of the building, his feet rooted to the cracked sidewalk. His heart pounded in his chest, a wild, chaotic rhythm that sent a flush of heat to his face. Could he go inside? Could he face those old walls, those old faces? The shame was suffocating, but it wasn't just the shame of his fall. It was the fear of seeing people who had once trusted him, people who had been in his care and didn't even know the truth of his decline. But something inside him, a whisper of hope, perhaps, urged him forward. He pushed open the door. Inside, the familiar smells of antiseptic and coffee mingled in the air. The waiting room, though smaller than he remembered, felt strangely welcoming, as if nothing had changed. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the same, and the faces of the people sitting in the chairs, some scrolling through their phones, some reading magazines, had that same look of anticipation, of waiting for something that would give them hope. Behind the counter, the receptionist, a woman he didn't recognize, looked up at him with mild curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked. James cleared his throat. "I used to work here. Dr. James Hartley. I used to be a surgeon here." The words felt foreign coming out of his mouth. The doctor he had been seemed like a lifetime ago, a version of himself he couldn't quite remember anymore. The receptionist's eyes widened just slightly, the barest flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Dr. Hartley?" she asked, her voice hesitant. You don't look the same." "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't." There was a long pause. She studied him for a moment, then offered a small, polite smile. "I'm sorry, but the clinic's really busy right now. You'd have to make an appointment." James nodded, turning away, his throat tight. He had wanted to walk through those doors and reclaim something of the man he had been. But now, in the presence of that unfamiliar receptionist, with the walls of the place he had once worked so hard to build his life around, he felt small and insignificant. The distance between who he was and who he had been was wider than he had ever imagined. But then something unexpected happened. As he reached for the door, it swung open from the other side, and there stood someone he hadn't expected to see. Dr. Helen Thompson. She was one of the older doctors who had worked with him at the clinic, a woman who had always been kind, patient, and fiercely dedicated to her patients. She hadn't aged a day, her white coat as immaculate as ever. When she saw him, her eyes widened, and for a moment, they simply stood there, staring at each other in silence. "Hartley," she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of surprise and something else. "Concern, maybe? I didn't expect to see you here. He didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected to see her either. "I came just to check in, to see how things were." The words felt hollow as they left his mouth. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, taking in the tiredness, the disheveled look. The years of abuse were written clearly in his face, but it wasn't just the physical changes that troubled her. It was the way he held himself, the way he seemed so far away from the man who had once stood beside her in the operating room. "You should come back," Dr. Thompson said suddenly, her voice gentle but firm. "You have a lot to offer, James. You were a good doctor." The words hit him like a punch, sharp and unexpected. She wasn't angry. She wasn't disappointed. She was offering him something that felt almost impossible, an opening. She was offering him a chance to come back. "I don't know if I can," he said, shaking his head. "I don't know if I even know who I am anymore." She placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet, steady gesture that somehow steadied him more than anything else had in years. "You'll find yourself again, James. It's never too late to try." The weight of her words sat with him long after he left the clinic that day. He walked back to the small hotel, each step feeling heavier than the last. Could he go back to being a doctor? Could he truly redeem himself? The idea of returning to the life he had so recklessly destroyed felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Could he even handle the responsibility again? Would they trust him? But it was George's voice that echoed in his head, as it had every night since their conversation. "You don't have to fix everything at once. Just take the next step." And so, despite the uncertainty gnawing at him, despite the fear of rejection and failure, James made a decision. He was going to take that next step. He didn't know what the road ahead would look like, but for the first time, he didn't feel like he was facing it alone. With every ounce of courage he could summon, he reached for the phone in his pocket and dialed the number for the clinic. "I'd like to make an appointment," he said, his voice a little shaky, "for a job interview. I used to be a surgeon here." The words hung in the air for a moment, but they didn't feel heavy. This time they felt like something else, like the beginning of a new chapter. The days following James's phone call to the clinic felt like an endless series of small, tentative steps, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen and how far he still had to climb. The weight of the decision to return to the place where it all began, the place where his career had first bloomed, before it had withered under the shadow of addiction, was almost unbearable. But with every morning that passed, he found himself waking up with a faint sense of purpose, a quiet resolve that he hadn't felt in years. He had made the appointment, but the wait was agonizing. Every second felt like a test, each passing minute drawing him closer to the moment when he would step into the clinic's halls again. Could he really do this? Was he ready? These were the questions that kept him up at night, swirling in his mind like a storm that refused to subside. But in the small hours of the morning, when the rest of the city was still asleep, James found a moment of clarity. He had already lost so much. He had wasted so much time. But he was still here. He was still breathing. And for the first time, he realized that perhaps that was enough. That maybe the simple act of showing up, of taking a single step forward, could be the beginning of something new. He dressed carefully that day, wearing an old button-up shirt that still fit loosely over his frame, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows in a vain attempt to look presentable. The reflection in the mirror was still a stranger to him, a man who was caught somewhere between the wreckage of his past and the possibility of something better. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't look away. He didn't shrink from his own image. He simply looked at himself and took a deep breath. When he arrived at the clinic, his heart hammered in his chest. The building, small and unassuming, loomed in front of him like a fortress. It hadn't changed much since he had last walked through those doors years ago. The same worn-out chairs in the waiting room, the same slightly musty smell of disinfectant and old paper, the same flickering fluorescent lights overhead. And yet, everything felt different. Every step he took toward the door felt like stepping into a past he had abandoned, a future he wasn't sure he deserved. Inside, the receptionist from before looked up when he entered. Her smile faltered just slightly when she saw him, but she quickly composed herself. "Dr. Hartley," she said, her voice a little too formal. "You've got your interview scheduled. Dr. Thompson is expecting you." James gave a small nod, but his legs felt heavy as he walked toward the back office. It wasn't that he was scared of Dr. Thompson. He had worked alongside her for years, after all. She had always been a steady presence, calm and methodical in her approach, a source of support when things had started to fall apart in his personal life. But walking into that office, into the place where his career had once flourished, felt like walking into a courtroom. The judgment wasn't from anyone else. It was from within himself. When he knocked on the door, Dr. Thompson's voice called out from inside, "Come in." James stepped into the small office, the same office where they had once sat together, discussing surgeries, treatment plans, patients. But now it felt suffocating, the walls closing in on him as he faced the woman who had been a silent witness to his descent. She looked up from her desk when he entered, her eyes sharp, but not unkind. "James," she said, standing up to shake his hand. Her grip was firm, but there was something else in her eyes, something that wasn't quite pity, but something close. "It's good to see you." He nodded, not trusting his voice. She gestured toward the chair in front of her desk. "Please sit down." He did, the chair creaking beneath him as he lowered himself into it, his hands nervously gripping the edge of the seat. He wasn't sure what to say or how to begin. He had spent years avoiding conversations like this, conversations about his past, his failures, the wreckage he had left behind. But now, in this small office with Dr. Thompson, he knew he couldn't hide anymore. I'm here because I don't know what else to do," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. His voice was raw, as though he hadn't used it in years. I know I don't deserve another chance. I know what I've done, but I want to try again. I want to make things right. I want to help people again." Dr. Thompson didn't say anything for a moment. She simply watched him, her gaze steady and searching. It was clear that she wasn't looking at him with judgment, but with the same careful consideration she had always shown her patients. She had always believed in the possibility of change, in the power of second chances. "James," she said finally, her voice calm and measured, "you've been through a lot, and I know you've made mistakes, but I also know that you were a damn good doctor. You cared about your patients, and I'm not the only one who remembers that." The words hit him harder than he had anticipated, the weight of them pressing down on his chest. He had thought that time had erased all the good, that his past mistakes had erased everything. But Dr. Thompson's words, that quiet acknowledgement of his former self, started to rebuild something within him. It was the first thread of hope, fragile and tentative, but real. "We're not asking you to be perfect, James," she continued, her voice gentle now. "We're asking you to show up, to do the work, and to help others the way you know how." Her words lingered in the air, their meaning sinking deep into his bones. He had spent so long running from his past, hiding from his mistakes, that the idea of facing them head-on seemed both terrifying and liberating. But Dr. Thompson wasn't asking him to be a savior. She wasn't asking for miracles. She was simply asking him to try. James swallowed, the lump in his throat thick with emotion. "I'll try," he said, the words quieter this time. He wasn't sure if he could do it. He wasn't sure if he could live up to the man he used to be. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he was alone in the effort. Dr. Thompson nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. That's all we need, James. A willingness to try. We'll take it from there. The interview wasn't a formal one, it was a conversation. A moment of understanding, of acknowledgement. And when James stood to leave, something inside him felt different. It wasn't a complete transformation. He wasn't healed. But the decision to try, to show up, to step back into the world he had left behind, felt like the beginning of something new. As he walked out of the clinic that day, his heart was still heavy with uncertainty, but it also carried a new sense of possibility. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the demons of his past would always be there, lurking in the shadows. But for the first time in years, James Hartley felt like he had a chance. A chance to rebuild not just his career but his life. And maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the man he had once been.